leaving the New York Times in September. What did you find there when you arrived, and what you're leaving behind now that you're going to depart and go through those doors for the last time in September?
When I arrived at the New York Times in 2012, I found a great newsroom. I mean, a great newspaper still. I think some of the best journalism in the world. But it was a company which was really struggling with this transition from its print past to its digital future. They'd made some inroads. They had a beautiful website. They had launched a pay model, though that was kind of slightly stuck. They had some revenue from digital advertising, though that was going backwards. And in the background, they saw their print business slowly dying. The print subscription was holding, but print advertising was falling very rapidly. And the company as a whole was contracting. And they'd begun to start firing journalists and reducing their costs to try and stay above water. And what we did over the 8 years was really try to work on that digital model to really build digital subscriptions to the point now where we have 10 times as many digital subscribers as we did 8 years ago. The company's revenue is growing and the future looks much more rosy.
Now, that is very top line. What exactly did you do to get there?
We did a number of things. We absolutely decided we wanted to focus on digital, and I got more than 80% of the people in the company focused on digital. We changed our leaders. We got new skills across the organization, particularly in digital product, in software engineering, computer science, and data science. We decided we didn't have to just shift from a reliance on print to digital, but a reliance on advertising to subscription. We said we're a subscription-first business. And we really started focusing on audiences, how they use the New York Times, and how we could get them to, come back to the Times more often, more times a week, more times a day. And finally, we changed the way we did digital. The New York Times historically had been very silo-based, different departments keeping themselves to themselves, not working well together in teams. And the trouble was, when we did get people to work together as teams, everyone in the team was looking back to their home department and asking for permission before they actually agreed to do anything. So instead of that, we've given all the power, all the real power, to quite low-level frontline team leaders. And these are leaders of teams trying to build engagement in the Times, trying to get that subscription growth to accelerate. And they've got everyone they need in the team. They've got a great testing platform. They can test and experiment. And they're empowered to actually make changes themselves without reference to their own departments and without reference to senior leaders. So we've become much more agile and much more fluid in the way we make changes and improvements to our digital model.
Mark, I once saw you talking about that. You said that most CEOs and executives talk about fostering creativity, but, and I quote what you said, instead we spend most of our time accidentally, but instead we spend most of your time murdering creativity. How can you stop that from happening?
By not trying to interfere too much and not trying to hope that every experiment's going to succeed. You're going to make lots of mistakes. You're going to fail. And once you've failed, you need to invest more and maybe fail again. You need to keep on trying stuff. But mainly, actually, you need to let the frontline operators, the actual teams doing the work, give them a lot of freedom in the way they work and in the way they do their experiments. As recently as 10 years ago, you could do strategy with PowerPoint. You could sort of, in the boardroom, you could get all the data in and look at charts and decide what to do. I think in 2020, you really have to let the flow of audience data and financial data guide you. And that's best done from the front lines rather than the boardroom. So I think one of the things you have to do is to recognize that you add value as a CEO by setting a strategic framework, by maybe setting some very big ambitious goals, and by getting the right people on the case. Once you've got the right people, most of the actual work is going to be done by them, not you. And you're not always the best person to decide what to do or what priorities you should have.
We all come from newsrooms, and in newsrooms, you let that creativity go up to a point. You still have an editor-in-chief. Eventually, you have a CEO, and if you let that to be too fluid, you can end up in jail because something completely stupid was done. How do you keep those controls as well?
I want to say that what I'm talking about in what I've just said is all about how you do digital product and how you advance the company. When it comes to news and the way you manage your newsroom and make editorial decisions, I'm pretty old-fashioned actually. I think a chain of command with an editor and a managing editor and lots of other senior, very experienced journalistic figures, monitoring, controlling, adjusting, changing still makes sense. So all of this is to say that in some ways a lot of very traditional journalistic skills, including strong editing skills, are still as relevant as they've ever been. It's just that you can't apply that kind of rigidness to how you're going to change the business model of the company or how you're going to make a digital product work better. That's not the way they do it in Silicon Valley. And if you try that, I think you'll fail.
Mark, you worked in broadcast before, here in the UK, Channel 4, BBC, Director General of the BBC before you went to New York Times, very traditional. You moved to the New York Times, very traditional as well. And what we tend to see all over, everywhere, anywhere in the world, is that where you have traditional media companies doing the transitioning to digital, the big struggle is about who is the daddy, who controls, who leads. And the tendency is for the traditional product, print or television, to be still seen as the leader. You changed that in the New York Times without damaging the paper, but you've done that, digital first in that sense. How did you do that, and how do you set about doing that if I am an editor or publisher somewhere else, when you have this total attention to the historically important newsroom and operation instead of digital, is still seen as the new kid in the block?
What I did, one of the first things I did was to, at the Times, was to create a print products and services division. And honestly, many people in the company thought I was crazy because they said, isn't the whole company a print products and services division? Don't we all do that? And my view was this, that look, print is a big part of the economics. It still is, to this day, it's a big part of the economics of the New York Times. But the company really knows how to do print. It really knows. They've got very deep muscle memory about how to sell the advertising, how to package it, how to print it, how to distribute the physical newspaper. So I said, let's take some of our best print people and get them to do that. And honestly, it didn't need anything like as many people as they had on it, because that's the thing the company knows how to do. Your effort as a company has to go into learning the thing you don't know how to do. So you've got to take the company out of its comfort zone, make sure that the traditional, very valuable, mature product, the mature platform, is performing really well. But in my view anyway, do that over there. I mean, find it, love it to bits, invest in it, but let it take place, in one part of the company so that the rest of the company can focus on the future. The investors of the company, the stock price of the New York Times is a belief by the investors in the future value of the company. That's how capitalism works. People are focused on the future. The company has to focus on the future. And when you know you're in a declining business, you better have a compelling answer as an organization about what your response is going to be. Are you going to give up and just run the business into the ground just for the free cash it delivers in its last years? Or are you going to try and turn it back into a growth company? And most news organizations have got a history where in the past they've grabbed opportunities. They've gone from being city-based to regional or even national. They've embraced colour. Some of them have embraced home delivery subscription. So they've got a big subscription revenue as well as an advertising revenue. And many newspaper organizations, particularly in Latin America, also became TV companies and very successfully moved into first radio and then TV. And I think, honestly, when I look at most legacy newspaper companies and look at their past, they did innovate, they did take chances, they did learn new skills. We just need to do it again. And I think we also have to recognize that this is a period where investment is really important. It's a very capital intensive period in the development of media. You need those engineers, you need new skills, you often need new managers, new leaders as well. So you're going to have to spend money. You can't do this by kind of eking it out in the way that you used to eke out recessions, that when advertising was deflated, you'd cut your costs, you'd trim your newsroom and wait for the good times to come back. In this kind of one-way secular shift, the good times are never going to come back. So it's really important to recognize that you need to find backers or borrow money and invest in the future.
Mark, you talked about investment. New York Times, quite different from pretty much most of the media companies. You will be leaving the company with more journalists than you had when you arrived there. One is, where did you find the money? And B, how important it is to have that level of investment in order to grow.
So the New York Times' print operations are very profitable. They've always been profitable, they're still profitable, and will be profitable, I think, for at least another decade. The existential challenge for the company was not near-term profitability. It was that over time, all of the indicators were negative. In other words, almost every bit of the economics was getting worse and was likely to go on getting worse. And that's the thing we had to fix. So essentially what we did is we've used the free cash flow from the current profitability of the company to build the future. We've taken the profits from print and invested them in digital. And that's meant we've actually stayed profitable, even though we've been investing hundreds of millions of dollars in new digital talent, in digital product, in digital subscription, and in digital advertising technology. So our plan was to, in a sense, instead of, if you like, taking the profits as profits now, to use the profits to build the future, but in a way that our investors could see the progress, could see that we were building a sustainable model, so that the investors would be satisfied with the way we were running the company. And what's interesting is that the stock price of the New York Times has gone up. Indeed, it's gone up by 5 times, more than 5 times since I came, because investors have been so pleased with the top-line digital growth. They've been happy to see all this money flowing into, if you like, new investment, which really is new cost, because they've come to believe in our plan. And we are lucky that we have a very profitable print operation, but actually most newspapers, or at least many newspapers around the world, remain profitable. The trouble is, in many cases, those newspapers have got owners or investors who are used to very high profits and who have not really been willing enough yet to allow investment to take place. So in a way, in conversations between news organizations and their owners, their investors and their owners, I think a level of kind of candor about what it takes to really make a go of digital needs to take place, because without the investment, if you just try and continue to do digital as a little operation on the side, which nobody really takes seriously, the risk is, it'll never grow properly. And meanwhile, that print machine you've got is slowly, year by year, going to get weaker till eventually it too dies.
The question still is for many, okay, fine, I get it. But I'm still swapping advertising in print, where I can charge thousands in whichever currency you're talking about, for advertising or revenue in digital that may be in the cents. How do I make it work financially?
I know that's a worry. What I want to say, if you take the recorded music industry, something very similar started to happen with the invention of MP3, late 90s, turn of the century. And a lot of very, very high value, incredibly high margin activities, in particular CDs, began to evaporate. And initially, digital was also problematic. Apple launched the iPod and iTunes, and very quickly record companies discovered they were getting much less money from that than they used to get with those beautiful CDs with their sort of whatever they were, 60, 70, 80% margins. But the music industry's adapted, and from about 2015, 2016 onwards, instead of year-over-year declines in revenue, they've actually seen their revenue begin to grow again. Now, it hasn't got back to what it was in the glory days, but it probably will do. And actually what's evolved in music in digital are relationships with streaming services like Spotify and indeed Apple Music, which are pretty lucrative. So having believed it was going to be impossible to recreate the economics of the old record and CD era, the music industry's worked its way through a lot of pain and difficulty to a point where it sees its revenues growing again. And in my view, I think at the one hand you simply have to accept that print advertising is basically likely in most markets either to go away completely or to become a shadow of its former self. This will happen at different speeds in different countries, but it's going. You can see it. You can see it's dying on the vine already. So, in a way, you need to have a proper period of mourning. It's very sad when you lose a super high revenue stream, particularly when it's very high margin as well. The New York Times used to have classified job ads worth $250 million a year at probably a 95, 96% margin. That category is now probably $5 million from $230, $240 million. So it's very sad, but you have to get over the mourning and the kind of bereavement and then say, well, what are we going to do instead? I think the music industry over 20 years has found answers, and there's no reason why the news industry can't do as well.
But if you're still there for the next, 5 years, 10 years, what would you be watching behind your back as a threat to the strategy you adopted into the future of New York Times?
So I think one thing that my successor, my brilliant successor, Meredith Kopit-Levien, needs to keep a very close eye on is the relationship with the big digital platforms, with Google, with Facebook, with Twitter, and so on. My view, by the way, is rather different from many newspaper publishers. I think that the best way forward is to figure out ways of working with the big platforms which are mutually beneficial, which work for their business models, and also work for the publisher. And I'm more optimistic than many publishers that can be achieved. And I'm more pessimistic than many publishers about the joys of regulation and compulsory transfers of money from digital platforms to publishers, because I fear that puts more power in the hands of the politicians. But she should certainly keep an eye on the big platforms. I also think that polarization in the United States and in other countries is another worry. And if the world becomes more polarized, the risk of the New York Times and other publications getting completely stereotyped into a political position, or you're only for liberals, you're not for conservatives, you're not for moderates, that also grows. But I think at the same time, I also believe that having really trustworthy, reliable news, I've been very blessed to have worked for the New York Times and for the BBC, who are two of the most trustworthy news providers in the world. That kind of journalism, I think, is good for democracy around the world. It's good for good government across the entire planet. And one of my hopes is that if we can sustain really high quality, serious, independent journalism, that in itself will over time reduce polarization in our societies.
You talked about this relationship with the tech giants, very much central and a major central attention. Places like Brazil, the same debate exists, but also what you're having. And like in the US, the Googles and Facebooks of life providing a lot of grants, a lot of initiatives, essentially giving money to media companies to help them out. What's your take on that? Is that a dangerous kind of a relationship? That basically you have an element of money to tie them into support. Is that something healthy? At least they're putting some back. What is your view?
I think essentially, I mean, I talk to the leaders of Google and Facebook in particular regularly. I think there is a genuine recognition on the part of the leaders of both those companies that it's in their own interest to be seen to help journalism around the world. And I think it's broadly, that's a good instinct. My worry, obviously, is if that's just at the level of gesture, and so it only happens when they're under reputational pressure, you can't build a long-term publishing business based on the whim of a gigantic global company who gives you the money this year, may not give you the money next year. You can't actually plan for that. To me, I'd rather think about this as a commercial relationship. Newspaper publishers need big digital distributors. You know, it is useful for the New York Times to be visible on Google search, so that people can find our journalism, for example, and come to the New York Times to consume it. That's worth something to the Times. But having the New York Times on Google is worth something to Google. The intellectual property of the Times, its brand, and even very simple headlines are one of the things that keeps Google relevant and makes it such an incredibly good business. So that to me feels more like a relationship about intellectual property and how should the creator of the property, in this case the New York Times is paying for the journalists, it's generating the news headlines, it's putting all the editing and all the expectations of a great news brand into its headlines and into its stories. That intellectual property is very valuable to Google. How should it be paid for? When digital began, the big platform said, well, you're getting so much free distribution from us, surely you should be paying us. I think increasingly the world's recognizing that news is not all the same, that high quality news is expensive to make, just as expensive as making a great new television drama for Globo or for HBO Max or whatever, and it needs to be paid for. Nobody's suggesting that Game of Thrones should be given away free, and I don't think in the end the New York Times' journalism should be free. So I'd like to get to a point where we have a new, clear and fair commercial relationship with all the big platforms. And we've seen some, I would say, early steps in that direction. Facebook, for example, has got a multi-year contract with the New York Times to provide headlines and some stories to its new news tab inside the main Facebook product. They made a very significant financial commitment to that. Now, I think that kind of way forward is a more sustainable, better model than a world of kind of occasional grants.
Moving back, you touched that earlier, the question of polarization. Brazil going through a very similar phase as the US in terms of the personality of the current president and the use of fake news as a way of the term fake news as a way of criticizing any media organization that says anything that he may disagree with. You lived through a good chunk of your time in the New York Times, facing New York Times as fake news by President Trump. What are the lessons you've learned, and what is your advice to publishers in Brazil who are going through very similar events and a very similar situation?
Well, the first thing is I think everyone's got a right to their opinion about the journalism you do. And my experience of politicians over 40 years is they don't like negative stories about them, and they tend to want to blame the messenger. They tend to want to say that's not true, it's distorted, or you're politically biased, or whatever. And by the way, occasionally that's true. So I think the noise and fury around kind of political coverage, which is true in many countries, I think it's always been there. It's understandable. Thomas Jefferson railed against the press, and indeed one of the newspapers he railed against was had been founded, the New York Post had been founded by his rival Hamilton. You can go and see the musical. This is not new. What's dangerous is when politicians go further. So President Trump using inflammatory language which might even tempt people to violence against the media, encouraging bouncers to beat up members of the press in his election rallies in 2016, but even as president, using really inflammatory language, enemies of the people, traitors and so on, about the New York Times and other journalists. That's irresponsible and could lead to tragedy. So that's really bad. And although I don't want to dwell on this in any detail, in Brazil, in many other countries around the world, language and actions by governments against freedom of speech and freedom of the press are on the rise and are utterly against democracy and civilization in the end. So I think we do face, not criticism is fair enough. I mean, I think Donald Trump is allowed to say whatever and believe whatever he wants to do about the New York Times, and to say it. That's just what we as journalists live in a way. We live by the sword, we die by the sword in terms of criticism. But I think taking the next step and actually repressive measures or even incitement against the media is really dangerous. And at the Times, New York Times, we've spoken out about it. In particular, our publisher, Arthur Gregg Salzberger, has had a couple of direct encounters with the president and has criticised him to his face for the way he's talked about journalism.
Looking back, what were you particularly proud of, and what would be something that you would have done differently if you're starting again?
Well, pride. I mean, like many people, I guess, listening to this, I've been a senior editor and manager who's had to let good journalists go, who's had to reduce newsrooms, at the BBC in particular. And I hated doing it at the time. And I'm very proud that we have a bigger newsroom now than when I got to the Times 8 years ago. There aren't many people in journalism around the world who can say we hired another 250 journalists. So I feel very proud of that, and I'm proud of what they do as well. I mean, the point is, the thing I'm proudest of all of is the quality of the work the Times produces, and single pieces. The Project 1619 about slavery, seeing the whole of American history through the lens of slavery and its aftermath in 2019, I think is one of the highlights of my time at the New York Times. The thing I want to say about what I wish I'd done, didn't do, and wish I'd done, is move sooner. The urgency of reflecting and doing justice to this moment of change, you can't move too quickly. Anyone who's got or can observe people under the age of 30, under the age of 20 using digital media can see that the world is changing at an incredible pace. COVID has reminded many of us that we can work remotely, we can work with digital environments like Zoom, as we're using now. We can stream the world's movies, TV, we can get radio. I've got an internet radio, I listen to the BBC in the UK, here in northern New England. It's moving really quickly. And I think the great tragedy is that many news organisations are moving far more slowly into the future than their own audiences, their own readers. And so although I think we have moved faster at the Times, I'm glad we were fast enough, and if I had my time again, I'd move more aggressively than I did.